Hello, it's nice to see you again. Last time I explained how to apply for CLBC service registration, as well as the criteria for funding in CLBC. Now, assuming that you have completed the CLBC service registration and finished the GSA evaluation, I will explain how to apply for the CLBC service. I gave a general overview of the CLBC service in BoTV episode 14, but to briefly summarize, it is a service that supports community participation and includes employment, life service, learning service, and community inclusion service. There is also the residential service, which is related to housing. Today, I will explain the community inclusion service, which is the most commonly applied for. It is called the CI service, and to put it simply, it is a service that supports various social activities, hobbies, and leisure activities for people with developmental disabilities aged 19 and over. Many people have referred to it as the day program in the past, and this can be considered the representative CI service. To receive this service, of course, you need to apply for the necessary CI funding for your child. This application is submitted to the CLBC facilitator. A facilitator is the person assigned to your child once they are registered with CLBC. This assigned person is called a facilitator. Some people refer to them as social workers, but the official term used by CLBC is facilitator. Families communicate about everything through this facilitator. In fact, the most challenging part of applying for CLBC services is receiving this funding. From CLBC's perspective, they want to provide sufficient support to every recipient. But since there is a set budget, they always find themselves in a situation where funding is lacking as they try to support many families. This situation has been getting worse recently, and the reason is obvious. There are always existing recipients who continue to receive services. But every year, as more people turn 19, the number of new CLBC service recipients keeps increasing. However, the budget is not increasing to match that growth. So, in the past, it was possible to receive up to 30 hours of support per week. But recently, it seems that this has become almost impossible. Here, I mentioned 30 hours per week because CLBC provides CI funding in the form of allocating a certain number of hours per week. In other words, it refers to how many hours per week a staff member can provide one-on-one support. For example, if a child receives 15 hours of funding and the support is provided on a one-to-one basis, then the child can receive 15 hours of support per week. If, for example, your child receives support in a 1-to-2 ratio, that is, one staff member supporting a group of 2 people with disabilities, then it means that up to 30 hours of support per week is possible. As for how the funding hours are determined and based on what criteria, I have already explained this in episodes 49 and 50 of BoTV, so please refer to those videos. Now, assuming that the CI funding has been approved, I will explain the next process. Once the CI funding is approved, there are mainly 2 ways to receive the funding. One is the agency contract service, which is provided through an organization called a service provider or agency, and the other is individualized funding, where the parent or guardian receives the funding directly from CLBC and manages it themselves. These are the 2 main options. It is up to the person with a disability or their family to decide which form of funding to receive. So, when you receive funding from CLBC, you just need to tell the CLBC facilitator in which form you would like to receive it. If, after considering your child's situation, you decide that it would be better for the parents to receive the funding directly and support a variety of activities tailored to the child, rather than using the services provided by an agency, then individualized funding would be the right choice. In other words, one of the parents enters into an agent contract with CLBC on behalf of their child. Then, each month, you receive the allocated funding, find the necessary programs for your child, hire the required people, and report to CLBC every month on how the expenses were used. Today, I will mainly explain the agency contract, CI service, which is the most commonly used option. The term service provider or agency refers to an organization that is qualified to provide CLBC services, having received authorization from CLBC. There are many agencies in each region. Hero Now also officially received agency qualification approval from CLBC in 2017. Recently, they are no longer referred to as day programs, but instead are called community inclusion services. As for the reason, what I would guess, that in the past, adult individuals with disabilities would attend the programs prepared by the agencies during the week, almost like going to school, which is why they were called day programs. But recently, instead of running programs in a set, indoor location, the focus has shifted to going out into the community and engaging in various activities. For example, participate in various activities in the local community, such as at community centers, libraries, or shopping malls. It seems that for this reason, the service was renamed to Community Inclusion. The reason I'm telling you this now is because families are experiencing a lot of confusion due to the terminology, comparing the way funding was provided in the past, when it was called the day program, to the current situation where it's called Community Inclusion. So I'd like to take some time to explain this term. In the early days of CLBC services, about 15 or 20 years ago, the funding provided by CLBC was paid directly to agencies. For example, an agency would receive funding to run a day program for about 20 adults with developmental disabilities during the week. At that time, this was called global funding, or block funding, as it is still referred to today. So, adults with developmental disabilities in that area would participate in the day program provided by the agency. If all 20 spots were filled, then any additional individuals with disabilities who wanted to join would have to wait. This means there is a waiting list. And when a spot opens up, they can participate. As a result, several issues arise. One is that the waiting lists are long in each region. Another is that it is difficult for families to choose the agency they want. That's because they have to look for places with available spots. And finally, this is the biggest problem. Someone was already participating in a day program, but if they have to move, they need to go to an agency in the new area. And if that agency runs a day program, but there are no available spots, they have to wait. So, from the family's perspective, they were able to participate in a day program in their original area, but after moving to a new area, they have to wait again, which leads to various complaints. That's why CLBC created a new funding method called individualized funding. In other words, they created a form of funding that follows the individual, so even if a person moves, the funding continues to stay with them. Well, there are so many different names for this thing, and I keep getting confused. This is called individual attached funding, and it's referred to as funding that follows the individual, or sometimes as individual direct funding, among other names. Since this is funding that follows the individual, it continues even if they move to a new place, and there's also the advantage of being able to choose the agency they want, which is why families tend to prefer this option. However, when a new adult with developmental disabilities enters the system, a new budget needs to be allocated for this funding. But with global funding or block funding, the budget has already been allocated to the agency in the past, and the same amount is given to them every year. So, from CLBC's perspective, global funding or block funding isn't about creating new funding for each case, but rather about providing the existing funding. That's how the concept is established. So, if it's difficult to provide new funding, when an individual joins, they are sometimes encouraged to participate in day programs that are already supported by existing global or block funding. So some families are told that there is no new funding available, but instead there are spots at certain agencies, so they are suggested to consider the day programs offered there. After receiving such suggestions, the families then have to make a decision. Since there's no individual funding anyway, they can either take an available spot, or if they move, they would have to apply for new funding again. So rather than doing that, some families think it's better to wait for the opportunity to receive individual funding that follows the person. In such cases, they choose to wait and they continue to communicate with CLBC for that purpose. Now, let's say the parents have decided to receive support through an agency. Then, the next step in the process is to first inform the facilitator that you want to receive the agency contract CI services provided by the agency. Then, the facilitator will provide a list of 3 agencies in the area. You will then need to contact these 3 agencies directly and determine which agency is the most suitable for your child. But if none of these 3 are suitable, then you can tell the facilitator again, and the facilitator will provide another list of 3 agencies. In this way, you search for an agency that suits your child. And once one is chosen, you notify the facilitator that you will receive CI services through Agency A. Then, CLBC will contact the selected agency and inform them that someone with a certain amount of funding intends to go to Agency A, and they will ask when the service can begin and coordinate the details together. Then when the agency responds with when they can start and everything is finalized, CLBC and the agency will enter into a contract. After that, the individual will receive CI services from the agency according to the terms of that contract. Usually, the CI services provided by agencies are divided into one-on-one programs or group programs where 2 or 3 people, or even several groups of 2 or 3, are grouped together. So families can choose the appropriate option, depending on their child's situation. In the case of one-on-one, since each staff member is assigned to one person, it's easier to participate in the desired program. If it's a group setting, you'll be joining the program that's already set for the group. Of course, each option has its pros and cons. When you choose one-on-one, the advantage is that you can participate in the programs you want individually. But on the other hand, there are fewer opportunities to interact with others. That's why, even in one-on-one settings, it's common to be mixed into group activities. So even though a one-on-one staff member is assigned, you still end up participating in the group program. As for the schedule, most agencies usually operate from Monday to Friday for about 6 hours a day. Typically, the hours are from 9 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, or from 8 to 2. And the number of hours you participate per week depends on the amount of funding you receive individually. That's about it for my explanation of CI services. Here and Now also provides CI services. If you are interested in the CI, please feel free to contact us. That's all for today's explanation. I'll see you next time with another topic. Thank you for watching until now.